Welcome to MacStories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Pocket Lists and Monday.com. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is another special guest in Federico's absence, Mr. Ryan Christoffel, my colleague at MacStories. How you doing, Ryan?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for having me on the show, John.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we had so much fun doing MacStories Unplugged last month, which is the podcast that we do just for club members, that, I thought we should have you on while Federico is furiously writing his iOS 13 review, because, you and I and Alex are all working on various stories over the course of the summer for different aspects of iOS 13 that aren't going to be directly incorporated into Federico's review. I did CarPlay because he doesn't have a CarPlay car, and I'll be doing something on Sidecar. And you recently, just a couple of weeks ago, did a story on the changes to Maps, which I'm pretty excited about and also kind of overlap a little bit with what I was doing with CarPlay. So I thought you and I, since we've got that overlap, could talk a little bit about what's changing in Maps this week.
Yeah, there's quite a bit in Maps for iOS 13 that, compared to recent releases where Maps has been getting these, smaller updates over time, where not a whole lot has changed. It's quite an update this year, and there's a lot to explore.
Yeah, there really is. And, Maps, just like rewinding the clock all the way back. I know you covered this in your story, but, the genesis of Maps was Apple wanting to end its reliance on Google as the map provider. But that's an enormous project to bite off, even for a company Apple size, because there's so much physical labor involved in driving all over the world, using satellite imagery, but also driving cars through the streets of every country in the world, trying to collect as much local data as possible. And Maps was really rough when it first launched back in whenever it was. And it's been a slow and steady progress since then, but it's still always been fairly far behind where Google is in terms of features, in terms of map detail, in terms of reliability, a lot of things like that. We have seen more data sources coming online as time goes by. I know that we've written stories about things like, electric vehicle chargers and bicycle share programs and all those kinds of new layers of data that's been overlaid on Apple Maps in recent years. But this is kind of an order of magnitude different from what we've seen in the last few years. What exactly is changing? I guess let's just start with kind of the basic map data and how that is evolving from where we are in iOS 12 to where things are going in the fall.
Absolutely. I think that the new map data, which we'll talk in more detail about that in a second, I think that really is the catalyst for Apple making all the other changes that it has made this year. So last year, I think it was February, sometime early in 2018, Apple worked exclusively with Matthew Panzarino of TechCrunch to share this article about its massive project to create its own maps. Like you said, for a number of years early in the iPhone's life, Apple relied on Google for maps. In iOS 6, it transitioned to its own Maps app, and it was dependent on data from other third parties for its maps. But now, after many years of work, it sounds like Apple is actually creating its own maps. And last year, they started rolling those out. So in iOS 12, California, or at least parts of it, were able to get access to the new maps, which feature a variety of changes that we'll talk about shortly. But this year, it's rolling out in a lot more places. And so with iOS 13 and then continuing through the end of the year, assuming iOS 13 launches in September like we are expecting, during those few months, there's going to be a lot more of the United States, at least, that gets these new Apple-designed maps. And we're actually starting to see that in the betas right now. I noticed that parts of Texas and I believe it was Louisiana have the new maps now, at least for me. From the research I've done online, it looks like Apple is kind of staging out the new maps to different groups of users as it stages it out to different parts of the country. But because of this being the big year when the new maps come to everyone in the US, Apple is kind of tying that with a number of new features and enhancements to the Maps app itself, which makes it really the biggest release for Apple Maps that we've ever seen.
Yeah, it is pretty big, and I guess we should talk a little bit about what that means. But I got to say before we get to that, I was a little surprised that I hadn't seen any new map data in the beta until now. I mean, as you said, California's been there for a while, and you can zoom in on parts of Northern California around Apple's headquarters and San Francisco and that sort of thing, and see the changes, because those were also in TechCrunch's article last year. But it hasn't shown up until, I guess there's some reports that it's starting to show up in New York City, but I know until just the last few days that it hasn't been in New York. It hasn't been in Chicago. I'd kind of, I guess, expected to see it roll out in bigger cities and other parts of the country earlier, but it does seem like, as we record this, that the maps are slowly but surely being sent out to people who, at least to people who have the beta. I'm not sure if it's showing up in iOS 12 or not. In terms of the actual maps themselves, though, we ought to talk about kind of the detail that is being added to these maps, because I mean, I know that despite some of the rough spots that Apple Maps has had over the years, I've always just liked the design of Apple Maps better than Google Maps, for instance. Just whether it's the typography or the way it's laid out, it always struck me as being clearer and easier to follow than Google Maps. And with this update, we're seeing some subtle changes to things like typography. There's more areas of greenery like forests and parks and things like that that are being highlighted in a pale shade of green, so you can kind of get your bearings as to, oh, I'm driving by a park right now, or I'm going through a state campground or something like that, as well as more features in the landscape, things like, I think, sports fields and parking lots and shopping malls. I guess shopping malls might have already been there, but parking lots, little details like that I think when you're navigating, especially, it gives you a better sense of where you are when you look out the window of your car or when you're walking down the street. Anything else like that you can think of?
One thing that Apple emphasized when they initially announced this project is that they are really focusing on providing better door-to-door directions. So with lots of places that you might go to, Apple Maps previously could get you generally to the building that you're trying to arrive at, but it wouldn't necessarily know, well, where is the front door or where is the entrance that I'm supposed to go in, which, has a lot of bearing on where you want to park, especially if you are in, let's say, a crowded urban environment. And something that Apple says that they're doing, which, like you said, the new maps haven't arrived in New York City yet. They're maybe doing that very shortly, it sounds like, but so I haven't been able to test it myself, but one of the promises of the new maps is that it will be able to provide better door-to-door directions so that you can get, say, that last, 50 yards or whatever the distance is to get exactly where you're trying to go, rather than just getting you most of the way there, but then kind of leaving you to figure out what's left.
Right. And I think one of the first things they did along those lines was they enhanced the entrance information for like public transit systems. So, for instance, if you were taking the subway in New York, you'd know based on these changes whether you're coming out on one side of the street or the other, or maybe, one block down from where the map previously would say you were arriving, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much of that is new versus what was available before. So I moved to New York about a year ago, and it's always provided the ability to see, okay, this is the exit that I should take when I'm leaving the station, and this is where it's going to pop me out. But certainly from what I've observed, reading about other people and their experiences in maps in different parts of the country, it sounds like there's just more emphasis on the precise details of, maybe once you park your car even, how do you then walk to the door to this concert hall or some other, maybe a big stadium or an office building? that's an environment where it's not immediately clear where you're supposed to go in.
Sure.
So that's one of those things that Apple says that the new Maps is going to improve, but I think only time will tell whether that's actually the case. And then another thing along those lines is that Apple says that controlling the maps now and having them designed by them based on their own data from, like you said, the vans that have been scouring the US for many years now, and the satellite information they're using, all of that, because it's in Apple's control, they say that when there are issues with the mapping data, which there undoubtedly will be because things are changing all the time, right? There's new construction, there's closures. Having an accurate, relevant map is something that you have to actively work on.
Right.
And so Apple says that when there are issues, they're going to be able to fix those issues much quicker than they were able to before. And this is based on a couple of things. One is that Apple is taking some data from just people's actual use of maps that is given to Apple in a very privacy sensitive way where they can see, okay, this person took this route, and they can see little bits of that route. I know it's anonymized for privacy, but what they're able to gather from that is, let's say you were initially told to go a certain way, take a certain route, and you deviated from that route. If enough people do that, then that's a clue to Apple that, oh, hey, maybe this route that we're suggesting isn't actually the best one anymore. Maybe
Right.
there's a road that's closed. Maybe there's something else that's going on that's changed things. And so they'll be able to proactively make updates based on that data. But in addition to that, as you submit issues inside the Maps app and say, oh, hey, there's something that's wrong with, let's say, this point of interest or this, whatever it is that you see that's inaccurate, you can report those, and Apple has their own team that can make those changes right there and then, rather than kind of having to funnel that information to a third party to update it on their side. And this is, again, one of those things that we don't know how it's going to pan out in the long run. We don't know if these promises that Apple has made about improvements to how quick things will get fixed will actually play out. So I've heard from a few readers since I published my story on Maps in iOS 13 who live in California and have had the new Maps for quite some time. And a couple of those readers have said that they've submitted reports of inaccurate, businesses or other location errors and haven't seen those change. And so, that had me concerned a little bit, because on the one hand, I would think that over the last year or so, when the new Maps have basically exclusively been in California, you'd think that Apple would be able to really be hyper aware of the issues that come up and really on top of fixing those. On the other hand, I could see where maybe because the maps haven't been in as many places, Apple's map team has been smaller, and potentially leading up to the rollout in the rest of the US, they are staffing up, and they're going to have a much bigger team that's much more capable of processing these different issues. I don't know. That's my optimistic take, is hopefully they are going to be better prepared to make those corrections quickly once the maps roll out to more places. But I thought it was interesting hearing that from some readers who are in California now, that it hasn't exactly been that much better than it used to be when it comes to making corrections. Hopefully that'll change.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Monday.com, the tool that simplifies the way teams work together. With Monday.com, not only can you manage work and deadlines, you can also cultivate a culture of transparency so everyone in your company works better together. There are so many great things about Monday.com. I want to mention just a few of them. It works for teams of any size, from a couple of freelancers on up to huge teams. I've only just begun trying Monday.com and was really pleasantly surprised to find that it works for everything from a small team like ours on up to big companies. It's also super easy to use. You can automate workflows, build a board from scratch, or use a pre-made template, which I find to be a great way to get up to speed quickly. And you can also upload files directly from your computer using Dropbox or Google Drive. Monday.com helps you stay on track. You can create accountability by assigning tasks to owners, and you'll never miss a deadline with the My Week view, which is like a personal assistant for you and your team. There's even an iOS app too, so you can work on the go. I've been using Monday.com for a little while and really like what I've seen so far, especially the ability to view projects in a bunch of different ways. There are things like project timelines, Kanban-style card views, and also more traditional spreadsheet-like tables that you can use as well. I also, as I said, appreciate the fact that it works for small teams like MacStories. You can try it too by going to monday.com/appstories to start a 14-day free trial. Again, that's monday.com/appstories to get a 14-day free trial of monday.com. Go there now and try it out. I think you'll love it. Our thanks to monday.com for their support of App Stories. I want to switch gears for a minute and talk a little bit about Look Around, because that's one of the big new features in iOS 13. And it's a little bit like Google's Street View, but at least in the demonstrations we saw at WWDC, it's a lot nicer than Street View to my eyes. I mean, what exactly are they doing there, and how does it differ from Street View?
Look Around is like Street View, a 3D view where you can pan around to see the exact environment. It's exclusive to places that have the new maps. So if you are in a part of the country or the world that doesn't have new maps, you won't have the Look Around feature yet. But it's really, to me at least, a more modern, more user-friendly version of Street View. The imagery seems to be higher quality. The interactions and the way that you move around on the map or within the environment, it seems a lot more user-friendly and accessible to me. One thing that's really nice is that you can, if you're in the Look Around view, where you're in that 3D environment, you can just tap anywhere with a single tap, and you will, zoom down the street from the perspective of a car on the street. And it's just much smoother of an animation than what you would see when using Google Street View. If you tap on a particular point of interest, something that's really neat that I highlighted in some videos in my story on MacStories is that you tap on that point of interest and the Look Around view will move toward that point of interest, and then the camera will pan around as you're kind of driving up to that location. It really feels just like you're in a car, which is not the case so much when you're using Street View.
Right.
Street View has been around for a very long time. I believe it's 12 years since Google first launched Street View. So, Google's been doing this for a really long time, and there are advantages to, the additional experience that Google has. But I really think that because Apple is doing this much later, they're able to, from the ground up, build a more user-friendly experience and a more touch-friendly experience, honestly. Because, 12 years ago, we didn't have the iPhone even.
True.
Touch devices were not as common as they are today.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I saw your videos and I hadn't realized that, for instance, you can, not only does it kind of pan to the location you're navigating to, but there's even Look Around data for things like a McDonald's drive-through, right? I mean, I guess some Apple truck drove through the drive-through and gave, to give people an idea of what the parking lot looks like even.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was surprising to me as I was playing around with it, just testing out in different parts of California how some parking lots are even supported. And, that's an interesting thing that seems like it's not really necessary, but it's a nice touch and it can be useful in certain situations. And when you are using Look Around, which we haven't stated this yet, but when Look Around is available for a particular location, you'll see a binoculars icon in the top right corner of the Maps app. And tapping on that will open Look Around. It opens at first in a preview window, so it only takes up part of your screen where you can see that 3D view. whereas the rest of your screen is still dedicated to the standard map view. But when you activate that binocular icon, then all of the roads and all of the areas of the map that have a look around view will be kind of shaded with this purple shading to indicate that you can move around to that area to see a look around view. And so you can do this, like I said, inside the actual 3D view itself by tapping around, but you can also just pick up the little binoculars icon, because once you activate it, you see this binoculars icon added to the map itself.
Right.
And so on that 2D map, you can pick up the binoculars icon, which is kind of like representative of a car. It even has a little kind of lights shining out the front of it, sort of like headlights, which indicate what view you're going to see in look around, depending on which direction that car is facing. But you can pick it up and move it around on those roads as long as they're shaded purple to move it wherever you'd like. And there's a nice little bit of haptic feedback when you pick up that icon. It's just a great experience. It's a lot more user-friendly. It's a lot more just pleasant than, at least for me, my experience with Google Street View. So Apple's done some fun, different UI things that make it accessible, and that overall make for, I think, a better product. Although, some of that will depend on the data itself. But based on what I've seen so far, I'm really excited about what Apple has done with Look Around.
Yeah, that really goes to, to one of the issues with Maps, which is no matter how nice the UI is, if the data is not good, the experience isn't going to be good. So that's the kind of thing where, as you said, you haven't had a chance to try it out in New York City yet, and I haven't tried it in Chicago, and it's going to vary from location to location. I assume that it might be better in more urban areas, but you never know. And it unfortunately is not rolling out to other countries just yet, but that will come with time, I suspect. I've heard stories of Apple cars driving around different parts of Europe, so I think that that's definitely in the works. I want to switch gears and talk to you about favorites and collections, because in my use of Apple Maps, I haven't dived quite as deep as you have into it, but a couple of things. One is there was a feature in CarPlay in iOS 13 Beta 5, which was called Share ETA. And what you would do is when you're in CarPlay and you're navigating somewhere, you could tap on kind of the destination menu item on the map, and it would pull up a set of options, search and some other options, but it would include Share ETA. And when you tapped on that, it would give you this list of people who you had recently contacted, either by messages or by email. And it seemed to favor the messages people. And it was a really nice feature, but it's gone in beta 6. I hope it comes back, because it was one of those things you could tap it, you pick someone like, your spouse or whoever it might be, and all of a sudden they get then a message in messages that your ETA is X, and it would periodically update. Like if you got stuck in traffic and the ETA changed, they'd get another text message telling them what the updated arrival time was. And I know that there are a couple of features like that, both automatic sharing and also per trip sharing in Maps, that have also disappeared. Could you tell me how those worked in Maps?
Yeah, so Apple has actually redone the favorites feature in Maps, which was available in previous versions of the app. There was such a thing as favorites. You could pull up any particular location, any business, and mark it as a favorite. And if you did that, then you could see that location a little more prominently featured on the map itself. So it would stand out a little bit so that it's easier to identify when you're looking, say, with a bird's eye view at the map. But you could also go to a specific, I want to call it a collection, but that's sort of a different feature here in iOS 13. But let's say a collection of all your favorites, where you could see a list of them, and you could access that from the Maps navigation panel. Now, the bad thing about it is that that option to see your favorites was buried pretty far down. So for me personally, while I used favorites before to kind of mark different locations that I wanted to remember to either try out later, or let's say a place that I visit somewhat regularly, but not regularly enough that that I don't need maps anymore. But in iOS 13, favorites have been given a more specific purpose, which is that they are primarily for places you regularly visit. And as such, they sit now at the top of the navigation panel. So that sliding panel that comes up from the bottom of the screen, they're right there at the top. There are automatic favorites for things like home and work, where you can set what your home is, what your workplace is, and those are available as defaults. But you can add any other location as well. And what those do is in that top row, you'll be able to tap on a specific favorite to immediately get directions to that place. And the favorites row even will show you, let's say, how long it's going to take you to get to that place without you asking for it first. So there's just a little bit of data underneath the favorites that will either say something like, this place is 5 miles away from where you are right now, or it would take 14 minutes to get there. And so it's a really nice change from previous versions of favorites, which really weren't ideal for places you visited regularly.
Right.
But now they are. And as part of that, which you alluded to earlier, there has been in the betas up until recently this auto share ETA feature where you can set up for different favorites that when you navigate to that favorite location, your ETA will automatically be shared with a specific person or multiple people even. And so that was configurable on a per favorite basis. So for example, I could set up an automation of sorts where every time I tapped on my home favorite, which meant that I was obviously navigating home, my wife would be notified about that and she would be kept up to date on my ETA. And that feature is gone now. I hope that it comes back. It seemed to work fine in my testing. I don't know if you had a similar experience, but I'm not quite sure why it was removed. But it was a nice feature, and it was one of those special benefits that you got from setting different locations up as favorites, because you could have automatic ETA sharing based on the favorites. But overall, I'm really happy with what Apple's done with favorites. I'm using them a lot. Just for things like, home navigation, work navigation, and some other ones that I've set up, depending on where you are. If, for myself, like I said, I moved to New York City a year ago. There's still so much of the city that I don't know. And oftentimes, even when I'm in parts of the city that I do know and I'm really familiar with, I'm still using navigation to get around because I want to see what is the best subway line to take for this time of day and this specific route, depending on where I am to get home. I may know that I normally take, let's say, the C train, but if you are aware at all of how the subway system works in New York City, it can be fairly unreliable. And so it's
Right.
always best to check what is the best train for me to take right now, even if it means that I need to walk a bit of extra distance. It may be quicker ultimately to take a different train than your normal one to get home the quickest. And so I'm just constantly hitting those favorites for my home and work to see, what's the quickest way to get to those places.
This episode of App Stories is also brought to you by Pocket Lists. Earlier this month, Pocket Lists got a massive update, which made it the first ever to-do app designed specifically for family collaboration. That's a big deal because too many to-do apps focus on business and your work life, but ignore your family altogether. Pocket Lists has a new family tab that integrates real-time collaboration and to-do list sharing and makes it super easy for up to 6 family members to work together in an efficient and productive way. Share to-do lists with each other, view family activity logs, assign tasks, and a whole lot more. The focus on families and not businesses makes the collaboration process truly friendly and very easy to understand. The UI perfectly combines all of the new family collaboration features with the ability to keep some lists and tasks private so no one else can see them. I think you're going to love the new Pocket Lists UI too. It's got over 400 vivid icons for building lists and over 70 built-in custom cover images, color coding, and a whole lot more. There's even natural language support for setting due dates and times that works in all 10 languages that the app supports. On top of that, Pocket Lists has all kinds of reminders for to-dos, on date, on time, on location, and repeating. Everything that you need and expect. It also has support for hashtags, subtasks, an Apple Watch app, an iMessage app, dark mode, and a whole bunch more handy features. It even supports Apple's calendar and reminders apps. So go today to pocketlists.com to learn more about this remarkable app. Again, that's pocketlists.com to learn more. I'll put a link in the show notes too. Pocket Lists, the friendly to-do list app for families. Our thanks to Pocket Lists for their support of the show. I've enjoyed favorites too. I've used them in the past, especially when I would go on a vacation or something. I might pick out 5 or 6 places that I want to try, whether it's a restaurant or a point of interest, and I'd save them as favorites, but they were really buried and it made it really hard to use and navigate to. And I mean, I guess I'll get to collections in a second, but in terms of the Share ETA, I found it really useful too. The only complaint that I had about it was that, for instance, it would float Federico up pretty high on that list, which is, I mean, as I mentioned in the article that I wrote about CarPlay, that's great because it's true that I text him fairly frequently, but the chances of me needing to tell him when I'm going to arrive somewhere in the Chicago area are pretty low. And that's a hard computing problem to solve. I kind of recognize that because on the one hand, it's meaningless to Federico how long it's going to take me to get to the grocery store or get home from the grocery store. On the other hand, as someone who's a parent and has a son who goes to college in Ireland, I could see wanting to know if I knew he was out somewhere and, maybe he's traveling by train to another city and I just want to know when he's going to get back to his apartment in Dublin. I could see wanting to know that even though he's very far away. And in that sense, the machine learning or whatever Apple is using to prioritize the people in that list, to me, there were people that were far too high up in that list because they were just too far away, even though they're people who I keep in close contact with. Whereas at the same time, as much as I want those people demoted down the list, I would like to be able to have anybody in maybe my immediate family floated up to the top of the list, even if they're far away. So it's a hard problem to solve, but by and large, I found that feature was really nice. And I mean, I think it raises another aspect of both CarPlay and Maps that I think Apple has recognized that Maps aren't always just about navigation. Like when you're going home at the end of the day, if you commute from a city or something, you know how to get home, but it doesn't necessarily, just because you know how to get home doesn't know when you're going to get home, because the ETA depends on things like traffic and even if you're on public transportation, the reliability of the subways or whatever it happens to be. And that's where these favorites come in handy, especially as you said, when you open up the map and you see the little bit of extra data next to your home location that tells you how far away your home is, or even better, how long it's going to take you to get there. That same thing exists in Maps, and it was surfaced. It's not totally new in CarPlay, for instance, because there was still an ETA-only navigation option, even in earlier versions of iOS, but it's surfaced a lot better, which makes it easier to use, and I think a lot more people would use it. And I do, like you, hope that the Share ETA feature comes back. The other aspect of this, which is slightly different but similar to favorites, is collections. And I had an opportunity to use this a few weeks ago because I was in Woodstock, Illinois for the MacStock conference with Stephen Hackett. And we shared an Airbnb that was about 20 minutes from the conference center. And so I added both of those places to a collection. And then I added a nearby coffee shop so I could get my coffee in the morning on the way to the conference. And this is in the greater Chicago area. It's not an area that I'm totally unfamiliar with, but it's not an area that I go to regularly. And it was really handy to have in a little folder called MacStock these 3 locations so that all I had to do was tap on it and get going on my way. And that, I think that's a big benefit to Maps this year too.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed using collections because you can do really whatever you want with them. The system is very flexible. You can save any location to any collection you'd like. You can save it to multiple collections. You can obviously set the name of your collection. You can even set a custom image for that collection if you'd like. And, like the example you mentioned, if you're going to a particular conference or you're in an area that you're not as familiar with, but there are certain key locations you want to be able to navigate to quickly, such as your Airbnb or hotel, a favorite coffee shop, all those things are perfect for collections. Another great use is I have a lot of exploring to do in New York City. Like I said, it's a big city. There's a lot to do. And I actually have set up different collections for different neighborhoods in the city. And within those collections, I've got a variety of places that I would like to go at some point, or even places that I have been that I really enjoyed and would love to revisit. So I have a collection for Chelsea. I have a collection for the Upper West Side, a collection for Brooklyn. And each of those collections just has a variety of, coffee shops, museums, other places that, the next time I'm in that area of the city, I know exactly what's around me that I've kind of vetted ahead of time and that looks like a good place to visit. And so you can do that. You can, use collections for broader vacation planning. If you're visiting another part of the world and you are working on an itinerary for that, you can put all of that in a collection. And the flexibility of the system is really nice. And the fact that it does stand apart from favorites, whereas before, the way that favorites worked, they kind of could be this, mishmash of various places that you've chosen to favorite, maybe because you're on vacation or maybe because you like to be aware of all these different areas in a specific part of the city. There's some kind of multi-purpose use going on there with favorites before, but now favorites are really designed primarily for locations you visit regularly, while collections are more like the grab bag of you can make them whatever you want them to be. And they just work a lot better because there's an actual organization system to them, unlike the previous favorite system, which was just one long list of a variety of favorites. So I really am happy with what I've been able to do with collections so far. I'm looking forward to, let's say, the next time I plan a vacation, doing that with collections. And, another benefit that we haven't mentioned yet is you can, once you've marked a location to belong in a certain collection, you can see that location more prominently on the map. Kind of like I mentioned that used to be possible with favorites and still is possible with favorites. If you're looking at a map that is particularly full of, let's say the density of Manhattan, you can see all those little locations that you have marked as important to you because you put them in a collection. You can see them more prominently. The font is a little bit bolder. The icon stands out from the crowd of all the other locations, all the other businesses that are there on the map. And so even if you aren't viewing the collection itself and the list of locations that are contained in it, just by looking at the map of the city you live in or the city that you're visiting, you can, at a quick glance, see all those locations that are important to you, whether they're favorites or whether they're collections. They all stand out a little more, which is a nice touch.
Okay, Ryan, I think that's a great place to stop for today. Just so people know, if you're listening to this and you're outside the United States, some of these features still do apply to you when iOS 13 drops in the fall. Things like favorites and collections, which we just discussed, that's going to be across the board. You'll be able to take advantage of those regardless of where you live. The map updates and things like look around are only going to be in the United States for the time being. Apple hasn't said exactly when other countries are going to come online, but hopefully, as I said, I've heard that places are being mapped as we speak, and hopefully other countries around the world will come online sooner rather than later. I want to thank our 2 sponsors again for this episode. That's Pocket Lists and Monday.com. Of course, you can find me and Ryan writing over at MacStories.net. And Ryan is on Twitter. He's iRyanTLDR on Twitter. And are you on Instagram as well, Ryan?
I am, but I use it more for personal purposes and not so much for anything Apple related. So it's nothing anyone would be interested in.
All right. That's good to know. And of course, you can find me on both as well. I'm at John Voorhees. That's JOHNBOORHWES. Talk to you later, Ryan.
See you, John.